Thank you. So anyway, about 6,000 years of recorded history. Could be a little bit more, could be a little bit less. But you can put creation at 4,000 BC. 4 to 10. I mean, you could make an argument for 10. It's pretty tough, anything past 6, really. But you can make an argument. So anyway, so if that's the case, all right, so this is 0. Of course, there's no year 0, so we'll make it 1. Okay, 1. All right, and so this is 2,000 plus. So 20 years into next millennium, and this is 2000 BC. All right. Okay. So the flood took place about 1,500 years. If you use the ages given in Genesis, the flood took place about 1,500 years or so after creation. All right? Yeah, maybe it's right there actually. But anyway. And then you had Abraham and all that. And so Abraham is about 22 to 23. Again, give 100 years one way or another. Again, using the ages that are given in the Bible. And then you got on top of that, then you've got Isaac and Jacob, which pushes it forward a little bit ways. And then you've got, according to Chronicles, you've got 480 years from the time of Solomon's temple back to the Exodus, okay? So that puts the Exodus about, if this is 1,000, then right in the middle, about 1,500 BC. Again, you could make an argument for 100 years one way or another, 200 years maybe even one way or another, but right around 1,500 BC. Okay, so from our time, 1,000 and then another 100, so 1,500 years before Christ, obviously, and add another 2,000, so 3,500 years ago, 3,572, if you want to round it up. So that's about the time we're talking. From creation to the Exodus is 2,500 years, about 2,500 years. Okay?
How many people were on the whole earth at that time?
The estimate, again, the estimate for Egypt itself, okay, at the time of the Exodus, the estimate, and it's tough to make these estimates, but some people, I mean, that's what they do for their living, pretty much. And the experts, okay, the experts put the population of Egypt at between 300,000 and 500,000. Okay, as we saw before, the number of Israelites is about 5 million. Okay, that's outnumbered a lot. I mean, a big time lot. Okay, I myself think that most of your secular historians today, their numbers are very, strangely enough, you would use the word conservative. I think way too conservative. I would put, doing just some calculations of myself and looking at the population of both Upper and Lower Egypt, okay? Upper Egypt is this down here. Lower Egypt is here, okay? The land of Goshen is the Israelite territory, and the Egyptians didn't live there. They didn't live there because, remember, the Israelites were sheep herders and cattle raisers and stuff, and the Egyptians looked upon that as a very menial, unclean task. Farming, they thought was wonderful, that's fine. But taking care of animal husbandry, as we would call it to them, even though they made use of it, to them that was a real low thing. And so you didn't want to live. You didn't want to live anywhere where there were piles of manure. All right? So they didn't live in the land of Goshen. They lived along the Nile, not very far one way or another. This area here, you see this little lake here, when the Nile flooded, there would be there's a low spot right here, and this low spot would be filled in with water, and this whole area would become full of water. And then when it receded, you could go grow crops there with irrigation. The Egyptians were the first, as far as we know, to use elevated irrigation. In other words, the Sumerians over here used irrigation, but they used what you call pressure irrigation. That is the pressure of the water, or just the water coming from the river flowing in its hydraulic state, moving. That's how they used. That was the energy that they used for their irrigation. The Egyptians invented a couple of different methods of elevated irrigation. That is, they could take water from a lower place and put it onto an upper place and then let gravity do its trick. All right. So because of that, there were a couple of areas, lowlands along the river, all the way down into Sudan, where the river, when it flooded, it flooded large areas and then receded. Then you could irrigate those areas, and because of the floods, would leave behind really good soil. All right. So elevated irrigation was not used anywhere else in the world for a long, long, long time. It took people a long time to figure out or to follow the Egyptian inventions. They had, like I said, 3 or 4 of them. They had this wheel that you could sit on, and like a bicycle, and had cups or buckets attached to it. They had big ones too that were run by animals. They also had a system of leverage where they could dip a big bucket into the river, and then they had 3 or 4 guys on this long pole, and using a fulcrum, they would raise it up and put it in the next level, how many ever feet that was, and then it would run and do its trick in gravity. There was a big population here. I have estimated myself that the population of Egypt was probably closer to 1.5 to 2.5 million, depending on how far down south or upper Egypt you wanted to include. I think that's true around the world. Now, the world population, the Romans, of course, were the ones who did census. And of course, we're talking the time of Christ. Rome, let's put Rome, the city of Rome was founded 754 BC, right around there, 754, 756, depends on who you talk to. So about 700 years before Christ. And of course, the Romans did census various times during their time. And we have those numbers from the Roman. Now, the Roman world ended for them. If you wanted to look at a map, a guy by the name of Suetonius and also Philo made maps. We would call them global maps, all right? And the Romans' global map at that time ended, these were the parameters, okay? They ended at England, or the British Isles. That was as far north as they went, about as far north as modern-day Moscow, the Ural Mountains, and then they went out as far as India and a little beyond India. So they included Ceylon already during that period of time, and maybe a few islands out there that they knew about. As far as Africa, they thought Africa ended someplace on the other side of the Sahara. Now you have to understand the Sahara Desert for the Romans began maybe about the 29th parallel, okay, began. Today the Sahara Desert is from the coast down. But in the Roman times, the first 100 or 200 miles from the coast was forested. It was green grazing land and forests and lakes and rivers. It was very nice during Roman times and before that. It took a long time for the North Africa to dry out. But if you take in, that was their world. And so when they say their world, okay, their world, maybe 100 million people at the very most, I think that would be accurate. Now, we know, of course, that North and South America was populated by this time, by the time of the Exodus. Again, 1,500 years before Christ. We know that Central America was populated, of course. We know that the very south of Africa, Japan, China was populated. The Siberian area was populated. And so, you know, to put an estimate on that, I would say probably at the time of the Exodus, you're probably talking about 250 to 300 million people. About the population of the United States today, a little less than that, a little less than that. Yes, sir?
I just looked it up, and it says 1500 BC estimated human population 461 million.
461 million? Okay, I'll buy that. I'll buy that, yeah. 300 is not that far off, really. But it's really a tough, you know, like I say, it's a tough estimation, you know, and that changes constantly. They've recently found a city, an ancient city in Mesoamerica that they thought they didn't know existed. And now they've done some excavation there and some archaeology, and now they've discovered that at least 100,000 people were probably living there at any one time. And so you see these figures can vary widely from year to year as they discover more and more people. Anything else? Any other questions before we get to Exodus? Yes?
Didn't you hand out a time?
Oh yeah, many times. Yeah, many times. But again, if you ever want to do this yourself, again, just remember, you draw a line, you cut it in thirds. And then you cut each third in half. And that'll give you the 1,000-year marks from creation to today, in a nutshell. And then all you have to do from that point is just fill it in. And you fill it in with things like, with Exodus, for example, 1500, the birth of Christ, of course, at 1 or 1 AB, 1 AD, whichever. You know, things like fall of the Roman Empire is always suggested 476 AD. Oh, gee, what else? I used to be able to do this. I picked out a date or an event for every century all the way from here to here, and it was fun to do. 212, the issue of Caracalla, the Edict of Caracalla. The reason today, if you want to blame somebody for anchor babies, blame Caracalla. Caracalla was an interesting guy. He was illiterate. He was a Praetorian Guard, a leader of the Praetorian Guard. Couldn't read or write. He was from North Africa. Probably fairly dark-skinned. Very ruthless character. Very violent, strong. That's why he was head of the Praetorian Guard. He assassinated the emperor and took over and became emperor himself. And he did two things that's still with us today. And it's interesting because, again, he was not of a royal family, not of a royal line, you know, and he did two things that lasted longer than Julius Caesar, anything he did, or anything Augustus did. Okay? And that was, one, the Edict of Caracalla. The Edict of Caracalla was that anyone who is born within the borders of the Roman Empire is automatically a Roman citizen. Sound familiar? Yes. And so various nations, as they made up their constitutions in modern times, or Middle Ages and modern times forward, the period of revolution in the 1800s, as these nations, they knew about this and they would either use it or not. Most did not. Most did not. The United States did not either, really, until the 14th Amendment. It wasn't until after the war between the states that the United States changed their policy. Before the war between the states, the policy in the United States was you had to be born within the borders of the United States, and both of your parents needed to either be first generation immigrants, okay, that is in the first generation, not themselves first generation, but in the first generation, or born also in the United States. So it was very limited. You know also that in that period of time, only landowners could vote. And you had to, of course, be male, and it wasn't listed, but you had to be white too. I mean, you had to be Caucasian or close to it. Okay, I think you could be Hispanic too. But basically, white males, property owners, were the only people who could vote for the first 150 years of our republic. All right.
Which makes sense.
Well, it does if you believe as I do. Yeah.
Are made upon the livelihood of your area, of your community.
Right.
I mean, if laws are made that you can't grow this and that,
Yeah.
well, now you're impacting the
Right.
community.
It was always thought when the founding fathers began our country, and for generations, a couple of generations afterwards, it was always felt that the only people that should be allowed to vote are people that the laws would impact directly.
Right.
Now, what happened after the war between the states is I think the thinking changed and said, well, a lot of people could be impacted indirectly from the laws, and therefore they should be able to vote too. So that's what happened. The 14th Amendment really came about not just because of the war and not just because of slavery, but because a whole change. You have to understand that in the 1840s and 1850s, you had all of these people coming in from Ireland, you had all these people coming in from places like Italy and Spain, you had all these people coming in from England, you had a ton of immigrants. And there were bad riots, terrible riots in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, all over the country by these people who had no say. And so the 14th Amendment really was a product of, yes, of the war between the states and slavery, but it was also a product of a change in the demographics. And the minority could not anymore hold down the majority. They just couldn't do it. And the majority, because the majority basically rioted and said, we're not going to put up with this anymore. So that's what happened. Rebecca had a comment?
To get back to character,
Yes. I forgot to say the second thing. Go ahead.
is change in the law.
Yeah.
Could quite possibly reflect back to what the Roman soldier tells Paul when Paul says he's a citizen.
Yes.
I had to pay a lot of money to become a
Yes.
citizen, even
Yes.
though he was a Roman soldier.
Yes. Yes.
So this being an uneducated man, not from Rome,
Yeah.
who serves,
Yeah.
I can see why he would make that kind of change in the law.
Yes, and also the thing that he wanted to do is, in order to be a legionnaire, up until that period, it wasn't until after the time of Constantine that anybody and everybody could really be a legionnaire. But he needed soldiers, and you had to be a citizen in order to be a soldier. Okay? It's kind of like the United States. Before the First World War, you had to be a citizen of the United States in order to, or a Native American, excuse me. You either had to be a Native American or a citizen of the United States in order to join the cavalry, for example. Okay? When the First World War came and the draft and everything, Congress opened up the armed services to non-citizens, and it's still that way today. If you are a immigrant, even today, an illegal immigrant, okay, for whatever purpose, you're here, okay, you show up at a recruiting station, okay, you sneak across the border today, Sunday, okay, you sneak across the border, you dig under the fence today. Tomorrow morning, you show up at a recruiter and sign up for the United States Marine Corps. Guess what? They're not going to ask you no questions, okay? If you pass the FSMIT or whatever that silly test is, okay, and where they put you on your various MOS, you're going to be there, and you will be a citizen. And you won't be a citizen, but you'll be a member of the United States Army. Now, the same thing is true. Same thing was true in Rome. So Caracalla did it for two reasons, actually 3 reasons. You are very close. One, he did it to increase the number of people being able to be legionnaires. 2, he also did it to incur favor of all of the various heathen and pagan tribes that were now living within the borders of the not to get elected, of course, because he was just the emperor. I mean, he made himself emperor, but to curry their favor so that they wouldn't riot, so that they would be peaceful and productive citizens. Okay, and the third reason he did it is because, as Rebecca suggested, he himself had to earn his way into citizenship, being from North Africa, and it was not easy or cheap. And so he had a legitimate cause here. He said, I don't want people to have to go through what I went. The other thing about him is he also built the largest bathhouse ever in Rome, and it still functions today. If you want to go take a bath in the baths of Caracalla in Rome, you can do that. Okay? And so those two things outlasted all the other emperors. So it's kind of interesting for him. But again, those are the kinds of things that I used to teach my kids when I was teaching history in middle school. And they would leave class knowing all of the most important things happened in each century of 6,000 years. And that was really cool. And I heard stories years later of kids that went off to high school and stuff like that and really blew away the minds of their teachers with this stuff. So it was a lot of fun. And you put in the Viking raids in there, and you put in Hastings, 1066, and you put in the Reformation, and you put in the Spanish Armada, all kinds of stuff like that. Or Queen Victoria's ascension to the throne in 1837 and stuff like that. And of course 1776, and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a lot of fun, I think. That's just me. Okay, yes, I did that, and I have it in my computer. Anybody ever wants one of those, I'll be happy to send you one. Like I said, you can...
Interesting, read about things like the aqueducts and stuff.
Uh-huh, yeah.
In Sicily, when I was over there, going from one point to the other in the bus, look at this.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, those things last a long time, yeah. Oh, some of them still used, yeah. In Bath, England, there's a bath there. That's why it's called Bath, where the Britons or the Romans built a bathhouse, and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, talk about going to Bath, and stuff like that. So yeah, the Roman Empire is pretty amazing bunch of people, really. They read just an article in the paper not too long ago about the Appian Way and how it's still used today. It was a road, and there are very few potholes. It's 2,000 years old and there's very few potholes. Yes, Bruce?
Yeah, when I was in Rome, they also talked, I forgot which fountain it was, but it's still fed by mountain snow through the aqueduct.
Yes.
The aqueduct.
Yes.
I found amazing.
Yes.
They made a point to tell
Yeah.
you, this water is not piped.
No.
It comes from the,
Yep. Yeah, they were really brilliant. Their engineers were really brilliant, able to make that gravity work for them. Really was. Okay, page 10 in your notes, bottom of the page, we're going to look at verses 15 to 22 and talk about those. So here we go. We're on page 88 in the Bible, Exodus chapter 1, verse 15. We're going to read from 15 to 22 and then discuss that. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth, and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him, that is the son, to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, and let the boys live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Because the midwives feared God, he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born, you are to, that is of the Israelites, you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Okay, couple comments here. A couple fascinating things about this. This is not unknown in the historical annals of the world. This is, as I mentioned there in my notes, genocide. Genocide has been practiced for as long as there have been different cultures and languages. Whenever a group is seen as detrimental to the majority, or if they're not even majority, but if they're kind of in the authority, for example, in this particular case, the Jews are the majority. They outnumber the Egyptians. No matter what number you look at, there's no way that the Egyptians outnumber the Jews. The Jews outnumber the Egyptians. No question about that. So, but of course, the Egyptians have the power. They have the authority, okay? And so anytime the group who has the power, or is in the majority, either one, feels threatened by the minority that is within them or nearby them, they will wipe them out. Of course, we are familiar with the Holocaust, which was not just perpetrated against the Jews, it was also perpetrated against the Gypsies, which were a separate culture, much different, of course, than the Jews, but still a separate culture and, frankly, a separate language, too. And also what Hitler and the Nazis referred to as genetically inferior, which would include those who were gay, for example, or anybody who had any kind of birth defects, or were in some way looked upon as being less than desirable to continue. Another example of this, of course, is Turkey going into Armenia, which it claimed at that time, and wiping out the vast majority of Armenians, which Turkey still denies to this day, which is really stupid and foolish and arrogant and prideful. I don't know why they just don't fess up to it. Other kinds of genocides, certainly the American Indians or American Native Americans experienced a kind of genocide, sometimes on purpose. There were certainly excursions into Native American areas where the orders were very simple, wipe them out. But in other cases, their exposure to Europeans brought various diseases and things like that to them, which wiped them out. So sometimes it was meant, sometimes it was not meant, but it happened anyway, no matter how you cut it. Various other extreme examples would be also more close to home would be in the United States, Margaret Sanger and what was called the Negro Project. I don't know if you know about it, but the Negro Project turned into what we know today as Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger and a number of other anthropologists at that time, Margaret Mead, for example, and others, felt that it would be best if the Negro people among us would be eventually eliminated from our country and culture. And so the idea was to teach them birth control so that they would not have so many children. And then in other places, especially in the South and in the Midwest, they would be given sterilization. They would not be told, for example, that they were being sterilized, but they would be sterilized without their permission, without their even knowledge. Some were experimented on with lobotomies. Many Negroes were experimented on with very early shock treatments to see what they did. It was very horrific. It was as much of a genocide as the Holocaust by all. Hundreds of thousands of black African Americans were murdered and sanitized, euthanized, you name it, sterilized in the name of science by the people who today are the inheritors of Planned Parenthood. this was called at the time, in the 1920s, this was referred to as eugenics. And if you know anything about eugenics, you know that it was very popular. A guy by the name of Herbert Spencer, Spenser, was a social Darwinist. And he became extremely popular. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I doubt seriously. I mean, you think of Elizabeth in the New Testament giving birth to John the Baptist. You think of Mary giving birth to Jesus. Neither one of which, as far as we know, had midwives for them. This was pretty common for the poor. The poor did not have midwives to help them. Midwifery has kind of made a comeback, at least in the United States. It's always been very popular over in Europe, of course, and various other parts of the world. I don't know, is it used in Philippines and places like that, Rebecca, do you know?
I wasn't involved.
Yeah, okay. I don't know whether it's used in other cultures, but it certainly is used in Europe and Britain, of course. You know, Call the Midwife. You can watch that on TV, which is always interesting and entertaining. The midwives in the ancient world usually attended to those with money to pay them, frankly, to be real fair about it. Now, there's no reason that, say in the case of Elizabeth, of course, remember, was quite old when she gave birth to John the Baptist. And so I'm sure there were plenty of women around her who, up in the mountains there where Zacharias lived. I'm sure she could have had the help of all kinds of female relations, and which would be just as good as a official midwife. Mary, of course, having traveled from Nazareth, the family not being around, except for shirt-tail relations, I'm sure, that lived in Bethlehem, she may and or may not have had any kind of help in the birth. I think it's a mistake to assume that Mary had no help at all, or that there was no women around. Just old Joseph goats. You want to use them. You want to have the pharaoh's uncle over for dinner, and so you want to put goats and have the eye of goat or the soup. So you go to land of Goshen to shop, and you're walking along the mall, the river's edge, and
Just having trouble with your mic, so
okay.
we're gonna swap it out with this one.
All right, we'll try again. You spy an Egyptian couple out for their stroll, and they've got a little baby, and the baby's all swaddled. How are you going to tell if it's boy or girl? Good question. I don't know. Maybe there was some cultural significance in the way they dressed them. I don't know. I doubt it seriously, but I tried to find out. I tried to do a little research in this, and I could not find out. So it would be difficult to do. But the point is that if it was discovered, then of course, and I'm sure this applied to all the troops and the guards and things that were in the land of Goshen and so on and so forth. So this, of course, would precipitate what happened with Moses in the next chapter. Yes?
Wondering about when they started this Planned Parenthood, whatever the organization was called prior to that, was that private organizations or was that government who funded all this stuff? And how did you know?
Well, in some cases, the states ran these programs. I know in South Carolina, for example, the state ran that program for sterilization. It was just in the news not too long ago. North and South Carolina both had to pay reparations to families whose ancestors were sterilized. I think the federal government, there was some grants given early on. And before it was called Planned Parenthood, as far as I know, the only title that it officially had was the Negro Project. That's what it was called. It was called the Negro Project. There may have been huh?
All colors, all races are involved in it.
Oh, obviously. But if you look at our demographics and you look at the change in population and such, you know that the African American population is of course declining much faster than the white population. The Hispanic population is increasing much faster than the Asian population, for example. Part of that is because of the direction or the introduction of these clinics, mostly in poor black areas in the larger cities. And so they are still, even though it's not an official policy, they are still being encouraged, more so, to abort their children. And of course, also in the last few decades, the black family, the African American family in the United States, has suffered terrible losses among their men. And their husbands and fathers just aren't around for the most part. And so that has exacerbated the situation where you have these men not being fathers and husbands and then impregnating girls, and the girls knowing that the guy's not going to be around. And so you combine these factors, and it's no wonder that the black population is dying off at a much quicker rate than anyone else. And this is why this has caused a great deal of tension between the African American population and the Hispanic population. In Los Angeles, you may know that crime rate is horrendous, and in Chicago too. But in Los Angeles, it's especially bad because of the gang wars between the African American gangs and the Hispanic gangs. The Hispanic gangs continue to grow larger and larger and larger. Their population support continues to grow larger and larger, and they have now incurred themselves into what were in the past decades strictly African American parts of LA. Compton is a good example. Used to be that all around Compton and that whole area down there, you couldn't. there was just no part of Hispanic culture in that area at all. Now they're right on the borderland of Compton and surrounding it almost completely. And the African Americans don't like that. And so the uptick in murders, the uptick in gang activity has become 100-fold. As I say, in Chicago, you can have 50 shootings, you can have 20 murders, 25, 30 murders a day, especially during the weekend. In LA, you can have 50. It's absolutely horrendous. There are places in LA where I can remember driving myself years and years ago. I wouldn't have worry in my at all, and I wouldn't go that direct. Orange, for example, the borderland between Orange and Whittier, for example, never in a million years, never in a million years, and it's just horrible. It's just horrible, and part of the reason is because the African American population realizes that they are being pressured and they're being outnumbered, and so they're striking back.
It's been going on for years that China has restricted its birth to one per family, is it not?
Did any of you see?
They've increased.
Not now. They've gone to 2 and 3 children. Yeah. But did any of you see this past weekend? Did any of you see the news piece? It was a video on China destroying their housing. These huge 50, 60-story apartment complexes.
And there were still people in them because we're quarantined. No, I'm kidding.
No. But there was an aerial shot. I saw an aerial shot, and I don't remember where this was. I think it was around Shanghai somewhere, but I can't swear to that. But there was an aerial shot of this huge complex. You've seen these government housing projects in the United States, like in Chicago, for example, where there's just one high-rise after another, just 20 or 30 of them. And there was this aerial shot of these things, and they were just going down like dominoes all over the place. And each one of them could have held I don't know how many people, and they were all just being demolished. Yeah.
Because there were so many.
Yeah.
And they were so old.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
couldn't be repaired.
Right.
And so, yeah, that's happened. That's been
Yeah.
happening for a long time throughout all.
It's amazing to see these things, though.
But China changed their rules.
Yep,
They
yep.
went away from the one-child
Yeah.
policy because they realized what was happening.
You can have 2, and if they're daughters, you can go ahead and try for a son, and you can have 3.
The problem for the longest time was the medical
Oh, yeah.
facilities could not keep up. So
Yeah.
they weren't having children for
Yeah.
a while anyway.
Yeah.
There just wasn't any
Yeah.
place to go to actually have your child.
Right.
Things
Yeah.
were swamped
Yeah.
for a long time.
Yeah.
Now I think they've got.
I have heard that they have been, and I think China has even considered birth centers to try and solve this problem. You may or may not know, Russia, for example, has had a bounty on children. Oh boy, since before the fall of the Soviet Union. I think it was in the late 80s, 87, 88, somewhere around there, that Russia began to pay couples to have children. That still exists, and the price has gone up quite a bit. And yet, Russia is one of the top abortion nations in the world today, still. Russian people just don't like to have kids. They just don't. It's still, even after the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia, there were only a very few years from about 89 to about 95 or 96 where things were, you would call, kind of normal, normal European kind of normal, where the stores were relatively packed and you could get stuff, and it wasn't hard to send your kids to school, and it wasn't hard to do a lot of things. About after 97, 98, 99, as Putin began to consolidate his power and the oligarchs began to really kind of take over, it went back. And right now, if you talk to people in Russia, I've heard from many people, many of our pastors who used to serve in Russia before they were thrown out, and they say from their people that they talk to, it's no better now than it was under the Soviets. Pretty much the same. Because the oligarchs act the exact same as the commissars. So, what goes around comes around. All right, so we have this genocide going on, all right? So this is genocide. Lest it be thought that such plans are the stuff of fantasy or legend, the record of history shows that such is in fact extremely common, as I mentioned. It was is even employed by God himself in the case of the Canaanites in Joshua's day. So God himself even ordered genocide. He ordered Joshua and the Israelites to completely exterminate the Canaanites. Right? So genocide being a crime of nations, if you will, is true, but you certainly have an exception here where God uses it for his own good purposes. So the question, what do you think of the midwives' actions of disobeying their, and it's their king. I mean, even though they live in the land of Goshen, they don't have their own government here. They don't have their own, they're still ruled from Memphis and the house of Pharaoh. But by the way, you notice here how in the text you have king sometimes and Pharaoh sometimes. You notice that? King means just that, king. It's the Hebrew melech. And the word Pharaoh is really a Hebrew derivative of the word house. And so when it says house of Pharaoh, it really says house of house. Or we would kind of, I think, say house of houses, or the top house of all houses. And so the idea is that in Egypt, the idea is, yeah, you had a top guy who was the Pharaoh, but really the Egyptians always kind of considered the family, which included also brothers and sisters and children, of course, was really the ruling thing. This is why you had many brothers marrying sisters in the history of the royal lines of Egypt. And this is also why, if you look at certain of the Pharaoh's mummies, you see tremendous defects. Because if you do that long enough, as is the case with the royal houses of Europe, all of the grandchildren of Victoria marrying each other, and this is why you had hemophilia running amok in the Russian royal house, in the house of the Tsars, and that's why was he a Nicholas, the little boy? Nicholas, was he a Nicholas, the little one? Okay, that's why little Nicholas was so sickly, is because he had hemophilia. And this was common among Victoria's descendants, and still is. It still shows up every now and then in the royal houses of Europe. So this is a problem, of course. But anyway, that's what the word means. The word Pharaoh means house. And it gives you an idea that this royal family is directly descended from God, from one of their gods, and the royal derivative or power to rule is in that family and only in that family, or only in that house. Okay? All right, so anything, what did you think about the midwives' actions? Good, bad, or indifferent? Yes? Okay, it was certainly circumvention of infanticide anyway, for sure. And we should also remember that infanticide has been around as long as genocide's been around, as long as anything of those things have been around. Yes, ma'am?
Says in the Bible that God approved their behavior and actually rewarded them with large families.
This is again an exception, if you will, to the Romans 13 passage where we are to obey the governing authorities. Certainly, the command to obey governing authorities, which is based out of the fourth commandment, to honor your mother and father, is superseded in this case by the command not to murder. Now, if you ask the question, which a lot of people do, and I remember in comparative religion class in college, before I went to Christian college. This was a big deal. The Bible contradicts itself, of course, they say. And they would say, well, my professor, who was a former Roman priest, said, well, very often in the Bible, he said, you would see that one commandment is held higher than another. I don't think that's fair. That's not fair to say one commandment is held higher than another. I think it's fair to say that one commandment can take precedence in time. All right? So in chronological time, you may have opportunity to obey a particular commandment first. So let's say, for example, in order to obey the commandment about mother and father and about government and all that, you have to be alive. And so the commandment about not killing somebody wouldn't be more important than the commandment to honor the government, but it would take place first because you have to be alive in order to honor the government, okay? So I think it's unfair to, we can certainly say these exceptions, and these are exceptions allowed by God, and that's God's business, and we could end it at that. You have to understand, though, when you're talking to unbelievers, or you're talking to critics of the Bible, or even Christians who just don't accept the Bible at face value, that you're going to get these questions, and these questions are going to be difficult sometimes. And they're going to say, aha, see, God allows himself exceptions. Now, you can simply say, yeah, so what? That's a definition of God. That's not going to satisfy the critic. That's not going to satisfy the unbeliever. That's why I say another way to go about it is not to talk about one more important than the other, but one just take precedence in time before the other, okay? I don't know, that's not a perfect answer, that's not a perfect solution, but it's one that will fit in many cases. Yes?
For his people, he can do whatever he wants to us.
Right. 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 Yeah. Yeah.
So how
Well, and you can even go further than that. You can say God gave us a commandment not to kill, and yet the Bible says that everyone who dies because God killed them. That's a fact. Scripture makes it very clear, repeats many times. No body and soul separates without either the act or permission of God. Period. The Bible is very clear on that. Okay? So you can say God kills anybody who dies, God kills them. Okay? Now, we certainly wouldn't say murder, would we? No, of course not. And that's what the commandment is about, obviously, is murder. You can also certainly say God knows everything, and therefore God justifies every one of those killings, every one of those in ending of life.
not that he needs to.
No, he doesn't need. Yeah, he doesn't need to. But again, folks, the critics, are not going to be that nice. They're not going to be that kind to you. They're going to. They're going to push this. They're going to, how do you get over this? Yes, ma'am.
The issue I see
Mhm.
as more difficult for a Christian
Mhm.
who does believe the Bible, who does try to follow the Bible, is when to decide that this time I don't follow the government, I
Mhm.
follow what I
Mhm.
believe my Christian
Yes.
faith tells
Right.
me to do
Right.
versus
Right.
I follow the government.
It is.
That's
Yes.
difficult.
It is.
Because every person has their own interpretation of that. I mean, God is God and truth is truth, but
Right.
we all see it through our own lenses.
Sure. Sure.
And our own glasses.
Sure.
And how do we continually make the correct choice?
Okay. Two answers to that. The first answer is to know God's will very, very, very well. Know the Bible really well. Know what God wants as well as you possibly can. The second part of the answer is a little more difficult, which is to follow your conscience. Paul makes it very clear that we should not go against our conscience. which is why our church body, along with a few other church bodies, recognizes and supports conscientious objection. Not only to taking up arms in the armed services, but various other things too. Conscientious objection is a legitimate factor. Okay, that is a legitimate factor. We have to even if I disagree vehemently, and I did during the Vietnam War, I disagreed vehemently with my friends in high school and later in college who burned their draft cards. I disagreed with them vehemently, and some were in my own Waltherly group, some were in my own church. I disagreed with them violently. And to be fair and honest, some simply did not want to go to the rice paddies, period. It had nothing to do with any kind of higher goals or whatever. But there were some also who were very, very determined not to be involved in what they considered to be an unjust war. They had been convinced, unfortunately, by myself and a few others studying Lutheranism, that Luther was very much against any kind of war outside your own borders that did not involve the absolute defense of your area. Now, this led, of course, to many long nights of debate about the domino theory and all that kind of stuff. But the fact of the matter was, they did have this high ideal. This is an unjust war. Some of them also said, I don't want to kill anybody. I don't even want to participate in killing anybody. I don't want to even be a support of killing anybody. I don't even want to be a medic, okay? And I had to learn, it was hard for me, but I had to learn, okay, my father was the one, a veteran of World War II. My father said, hey, you have to honor their conscience, all right? You have to honor their conscience. And yes, ma'am.
We know that God has.
Right. Well, because we don't always know God's plan. I mean, we know He has one. Yeah, we know He has one. Yeah, we know He has one, but we're not sure which direction we go is part of the plan. Does God want me to go to Canada, where I'll maybe meet my future wife and raise a whole bunch of good Christian children through them? Does God want me to run off to Mexico and I'll learn Spanish and become a missionary? I mean, or does God want me to pick up an M16 and go into the rice paddies and bring home a Vietnamese wife and convert her to Christianity? I mean, again, that's why I say that it's difficult. It is difficult, and Rebecca makes an excellent point here that unless we can know for sure what is going on exactly, and when it comes to governments in general, and our government in particular, okay, we very seldom know what's really going on, what's really happening. I mean, did we invade Iraq to get rid of weapons of mass destruction, or did we invade Iraq so that George Jr. could pay off George Sr.? Okay? I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows. I don't think historians even know to this day, right? It could be either one. Now, this then, goes to, well, do you obey the government anyway? It depends on your conscience. I use my father as a good example. Last 3 minutes, I use my father as a good example. My father did not believe in the Second World War. Did not believe in it. Did not run out and enlist on January 8th. His best friends growing up were Japanese. His closest buddies, his closest pals, kids he went to first grade with, 2 twin Japanese boys who owned the orchid ranch next to our orange groves in Whittier. And the family was his best friend, Hashimoto family. And they were best friends. Also, his roommate in college in 1941, the fall of 41, was the son of Admiral Yamamoto. They were fraternity brothers. They were very close. He was also a historian even in those days at 20 years old. He was a very good historian. And he followed politics very closely. He considered that the oil embargo in 1940, placed on the Japanese by Franklin Roosevelt, was Roosevelt's way of getting into World War II. He blamed Roosevelt. He always felt to his dying breath that Pearl Harbor was planned, that it was known by the Roosevelt administration and by the president himself, and allowed to happen. He believed that. He believed that in 1941. He believed that in 1942. But when his draft notice came in January of 42, he said, I have to obey the government. My government, may it always be right, as Stephen Decatur said, but my government, right or wrong. Now that was his own conscience, that he decided to go that direction. He could easily have gone the other direction. Of course, conscientious objectors in those days were put in prison, but he could have gone that way. But he didn't. And he told my mother at the time, they weren't married yet, but he told my mother at the time, I hope I get sent to Europe. He wasn't, of course. He was sent to the Pacific. And the first soldier he killed, he had to do it face to face. He had to do it hand to hand. And the day before he died, I visited him in a nursing home, and he was curled up in a ball, fetal position. And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I still see that face. I still see that face." He said, "I can still see the pupils dilate." Because he had to kill him with his knife. And he said, "It haunts me to this day." When he got back from the war, to his credit, when he got back from the war, he started a program through the 4-H, with the 4-H in Japan. And every year, for 35 years, he brought young Japanese boys over to learn the citrus business on our ranch. And to see him with those Japanese boys was always a great pleasure for me and for my brothers, because they became very close friends. And many of them he led to Christianity. Many of them. He brought them all to church always. And many of them he led to Christianity. And some of them went back and became Christian missionaries. So here's a choice where it was very difficult. He was convinced this was an unjust war, even though we call it the good war. Okay? To him, it wasn't a good war. It wasn't a good war at all, as far as he was concerned. He agreed with Lindbergh, Father Conklin, those guys. He was a follower of those guys. Isolationist, you call him. But when the draft notice came, I said, okay, this is what God wants me to do. Went off and did it. We will pick it up on the top of page 11 and go into chapter 2.
Country, right or wrong.
Right. Yeah. Stephen Decatur.
Well, that's amazing because
Yeah.
I don't agree with what we did, but it's my
Yeah, and that is kind of part and parcel of what we in this life today call patriotism around the world. I mean, you could say the same thing for the Nazis. Hey, I was given an order to guard this concentration camp. I didn't shoot any Jews. I didn't put anybody in the oven. I didn't gas anybody. I was just a guard. But that's not allowed, as usually happens in American or world history, the winners get to choose what's right and wrong. And
It's kind of amazing that we think that that's patriotism.
Yeah.
because my country
Yeah.
right or wrong, but the Nazis do it, and
that's bad. Yeah, yeah, that's bad. Yeah, yeah. It's typical. I mean, nationalism kind of overrules everything else sometimes. Okay, let's close. May the grace of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us all. Amen.